first time here, and I just really love the premise of this whole conference, this whole event, so very happy to be here to talk about this. So a few things is that this is the beginnings of a project that I'm thinking about. It's more experimental, so this is also why I thought maybe I would try something a little bit new, try it out in a venue such as this. Another thing is I'm not trying to criticize or endorse anything here, but rather I'm trying to present a picture for us to think about, as well as to highlight the importance of esotericism for the history of science. I also think it will help us think about certain elements of our current moment, which Eric Davis laid out so wonderfully for us this morning. Certain things about beings, beings of transformation, and so on in this current time. So that's another reason why I thought maybe this will be relevant to the theme of this conference. So just a couple quick background points here. I'm going to go through it rather quickly here, just in case someone is not familiar with the history of UFOs and ufology. The phenomenon of UFOs begins roughly with the Foo Fighters phenomenon, which was a term used by Allied aircraft pilots of World War II to describe unidentified flying objects, metallic spheres, balls of light, witnessed in the skies over the European and the Pacific. Another key event that almost everyone knows about is, of course, the Roswell event, in which a farmer finds strange alien debris supposedly on his land, and then there's this whole thing about whether it was covered up or not. The next important thing I want to highlight here is the Project Blue Book, which is a secret government project that was used to try to understand during this time and study unidentified flying objects to see if they are a national security threat, and to scientifically analyze the phenomenon. The final thing, which I'll come back to, is this Area 51 thing. This is a highly classified remote government base. Primary purpose is publicly unknown. Most likely development and testing of experimental aircraft and weapons systems. On the 25th of June, 2013, following a FOIA request, which was filed in 2005, the CIA publicly acknowledged the existence of the base for the first time. Publicly acknowledged it. So just sort of some background of how we got to where we are now, which is what I'm going to show you next. This is, of course, the famous front page of the Roswell incident, when it was announced that this thing had crashed, this unidentified flying object. So the current situation that I want to just sort of highlight here a little bit is a story that broke in the New York Times in 2017 by Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal. This New York Times article revealed a secret program called ATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which was a program, a secret unknown program within the government, within the Pentagon, to be studying these reports, is what the article talked about. This, though, began a massive public engagement with UFOs in the public spotlight again, trying to also connect it to some new terminology, unidentified aerial phenomenon. So UAPs was this sort of other term that was also introduced with this article. This article also connected videos that had been released for the first time that showed, like this one, supposedly military and Air Force personnel sort of interacting with these unidentified objects. So out of this moment grew a more public interest. The internet, of course, is a key factor in all this. More public interest and public conversations. So one of the people cited in this article is Lou Elizondo, who is former U.S. Army counterintelligence special agent. He, at this time, had been working for this program, according to the article, and then coming out of the program began something called To the Stars Academy with the guitarist of Blink-182 and other former or current government employees. This was like a kind of entertainment / scientific project to kind of make the UFO phenomenon, the UAP phenomenon, more respectable, take it seriously. Things they talked about was the especially sort of exotic materials. Sometimes they're referred to as metamaterials, or testing these exotic materials that they talked about having access to see their composition and whether or not they're man-made, natural, and so on. So this is just one thread that they were interested in. But just within the last maybe 6 months or a year, it's sort of taken another interesting turn when it was revealed that the ATIP was actually just a nickname for a larger program called OSAP, which was Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Applications Program, to study all forms of paranormal activity at the infamous Skinwalker Ranch under the guise of working on new forms of military technology. So this is a ranch that was purchased by Robert Bigelow of Bigelow Aerospace that supposedly has lots of paranormal activity and UFO sightings and so forth that happens there all the time. There was one senator involved, Senator Harry Reid, in this program. And this book right here, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, written by James Lakatsky, he sort of argued that this was what the real program was about. It was more about studying paranormal stuff, including UFOs, but they had to kind of mask it in military technology in order to get the funding and so forth. But this has caused some people who sort of jumped on this ATIP bandwagon to question the whole, maybe not to question the whole project, the whole history itself, but to sort of I don't know, do a sort of rethink, and sometimes maybe even more negative and critical response. So this was one episode of this show, The Basement, which was the Basement Office show, which was connected to the New York Post. They sort of released this video after some of this other information came out, kind of critiquing or questioning the whole validity of this whole line, this whole recent public interest in the UFO phenomenon. But at any rate, it definitely started a new engagement with the government, with the Pentagon. And so inside next year's Senate Intelligence Authorization Bill, for example, you find the following sentence: cross-domain transmedium threats to United States national security are expanding exponentially, end quote. It has a clause that says, unidentified aerial phenomena. This provision establishes an office to carry out the mission currently performed by the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force to submit an annual report on unidentified aerial phenomena. So, in other words, Congress, Department of Defense, the Pentagon, all happening in the US, obviously, is taking UFOs more seriously and even suggesting that whatever these things are, perhaps they're not man-made, as you can see from this article here. So, because this is just an experimental thing I'm doing here, this is just sort of thoughts in response to this. So I wrote here, advanced technology as dematerializing trickery and magic. You can already see many of the elements that are a theme of this conference. So it's the technology itself is dematerializing and rematerializing in different forms, different ways. So there's, rather than just the narrative is obviously one thing, but it's the technology itself too that has this quality to it in this current direction of this whole conversation. So before I move into Hynek, this is just one example of where I'm going to go next with this. A recent statement made by Wisconsin Representative Mike Gallagher, who said that he's been on many of these shows now and podcasts and so forth talking about this UFO thing from a governmental perspective, says that UFOs, maybe they're us from the future, or something like this. This is a trope that I'm going to highlight, actually. So I want to talk about this. So that's where we are now, but we're going to go back now to J. Allen Hynek, who I think is someone who's very important in the history of all this, and connect him up to esotericism. So J. Allen Hynek was connected to and one of the major consultants on this Project Blue Book. He was born under Halley's Comet. He was a professional astronomer, worked at several prestigious university observatories, then had an astronomy position at Northwestern. During the war, he helped to develop the top-secret proximity fuse, rocket testing. He worked with Project Sign, which later became Project Blue Book. He was instrumental in developing systems that tracked man-made objects in Earth orbit. So this is all happening around the time the space race and Sputnik and so forth. These images at the bottom here are from a Utah UFO fleet filmed by Navy officer Delbert Newhouse in 1952. And at the time, Hynek was attributing many of these sightings to natural phenomena, weather phenomena and so forth, but this is one example that it was one of the first video footage taken of something like this, and he was quite convinced that this might be kind of the smoking gun for this whole thing. He said many were like weather phenomena, but he also took many cases seriously. He publicly suggested that the witness behind another famous case later was perhaps swamp gas. And so this moment in the 60s where he attributed this to swamp gas publicly sort of became, even though he had taken other ones seriously, this sort of made him a kind of UFO expert celebrity, but also it created this sort of media hysteria, what's the word? Hysteria, yes. Media hysteria, in which people were angry that people wanted them to be taken seriously and were angry that he was attributing them to natural phenomena and so forth. But the result of that was a commission. I mean, it forced the government to sort of do something about it, and then the government concluded famously with this commission that UFOs were not worth taking seriously. They did not pose a threat to national security, and then Project Blue Book was disbanded. Hynek then apparently felt liberated by this, no longer being confined by the restrictions of the Air Force, which had exerted pressure on him to get rid of them as natural phenomena. He later then founded his own research society, his own research center to study UFOs, and these are just some images from Project Blue Book. He then he began earlier than this already, but after this period, these are some of his books. He starts working with another scientist, Jacques Vallée. They're friends, and he's kind of his mentor. Vallée was a doctoral student when they met. But through this conversation in the 70s, they shifted the whole UFO hypothesis to, rather than being physical technology, to the interdimensional hypothesis, which is that perhaps these are some kind of phenomena from another dimension that is what's being reported and what's being seen. Jeff Kripal, in his book Authors of the Impossible, argues that such an idea began with spiritualism and interest in the so-called fourth dimension during the 19th century, and then moved into this later phase in ufology. They also started talking about the connection between mental and technology, which is something that's important to this, but I don't have enough time, so I'm not going to follow that thread. I'm going to follow this other thread. So Hynek and esotericism. In an interview in 1993, Vallée reported that in this interview, Vallée said, as a young student, I must have been 18 or 19 when I first became interested in, when I really began looking for information about traditions, and I became aware of the fact that science didn't just come out of the imagination of a few people, that there was a tradition of research that went very far back. This is what led me to the Rosicrucian tradition. The interviewer says, I was surprised to learn that Dr. Hynek was also a member for many years. Vallée responds, yes, I was delighted to learn that he had for many years gotten information from this tradition as well. We both came to the same conclusion, by the way, that we really didn't need an organization to continue this research, but those organizations were very sincere and gave us a start, end quote. So Vallée and his friend and mentor, J. Allen Hynek, were both interested in and were trained in elements of Rosicrucianism. In my opinion, this simultaneous interest in both science and esotericism in fact helped the UFO phenomenon to be better understood from a more serious scientific perspective. But how deep does this influence go? According to one ufologist, Hynek reportedly once told him that elementals or nature spirits were the cause of the UFO phenomenon. Another UFO researcher claimed that Hynek told her to read the book Theosophy by the esotericist philosopher Rudolf Steiner, that this was a most important book. John Franch, in his article, The Secret Life of John Hynek, writes, quote, it is easy to question the veracity of this startling claim, but it makes sense when one realizes that Hynek was strongly influenced by Steiner. In Steiner's view, elementals, spirits of air, earth, water, and ether, dwelled in this hidden realm inaccessible to the senses. If Hynek did indeed believe that UFOs were nature spirits, he may have specifically identified them with this last class of elemental, the etheric beings of the higher elements. So because of my time, I'm going to skip a little bit. Maybe I summarize. So Vallée has been publishing his diaries, and he has reported many conversations between Hynek and Vallée. In one of them, he reveals that yes, I studied Rudolf. They both were studying Rosicrucianism, and that Hynek thought that of the Rosicrucians, he had read Max Heindel, he had read Manly P. Hall, and he thought Steiner was the deepest of the group. And later, Vallée says, quote, "Alan and I had a long talk when we sat by the pool this afternoon, it was 1978, about our common interest in Rosicrucian philosophy. And Alan told me that he continued to have the highest regard for the theories of Rudolf Steiner," end quote. Later, in the 1980s, when the year leading up to Hynek's death, Vallée also reports that his wife, Mimi, read him passages of Rudolf Steiner as he was ill. After he passed away, a quote from this book right here about the biography of Hynek, The Close Encounters Man. It's a very interesting book. It says, the son of Hynek says, "Respecting my father's wishes, we did not cremate him for 3 days, which is a Rosicrucian belief," end quote. Following his death, Vallée writes the following, quote, "Mimi said he had requested that she entrust me with his private Rosicrucian archives. She also gave me the Steiners, the Heindels, written in the pompous language of occultism of the 30s. Some of those volumes were studiously annotated by the young astronomer. When I read his annotations of Rudolf Steiner's knowledge of the higher worlds, his favorite bedside book, I feel that some of our dialogue continues." And he goes on to show a little bit about how, what kind of things Hynek was underlining in these Rosicrucian Steiner books. So that's Hynek. To have someone read Steiner to you rather than the Bible when you're nearing the end of your life is quite significant, I think, in my opinion. So one of the books that's from Steiner that Hynek also read from the start of his interest in esotericism was another one called Occult Science. In this book, Steiner developed an esoteric cosmology based on theosophy and the idea of a spiritual science. In this system, the planet itself is evolving, just like in theosophy, culminating in a planet he called Vulcan. This is Steiner's terminology for this. And I'm going to read a quote real quick from Steiner about this planet Vulcan. He says that from this planet Vulcan, it's the highest evolved condition of the planet and of human beings on this planet. But he says that superhuman earthly beings are already here. Quote, "An event of great significance came to pass at the end of the 70s of the last century." It's the 19th century. "Since the end of the 70s of the last century, other beings, not of the human order," and in the Germany it just says not human, "have been descending to the earth for the purposes of their further development. From cosmic realms beyond the earth, they come down to earth and enter into a definite relationship with human beings. Since the 80s of the 19th century, super-earthly beings have been seeking to enter the sphere of earth existence. Just as the Vulcan men were the last to come down to earth, so now Vulcan beings are actually coming into the realm of earthly existence. Super-earthly beings are already here, and the fact that we are able to have a connected body of spiritual science, meaning his esotericism, is due to the fact that these beings are here bringing these messages to us." He then says, though, that human beings are ignoring them and not giving them enough attention. So he goes on in this lecture to develop a whole interesting argument about how there are sort of evil forces, evil beings here, but then there are also these good beings coming who are not human, coming from out of the solar system, trying to bring us these messages of wisdom. And he also goes on to say that if we don't listen to them, then the planet will get more and more in chaotic condition and so forth. So this sounds like familiar tropes, for instance, in the Bringers of the Dawn book and the teachings from the Pleiadians, in which the UFOs, the aliens, are sort of here to give us, bring us peace, give us the higher wisdom, something like that. And Hynek himself later was interested also in kinds of paranormal phenomenon and channeling. For example, he endorsed Dorothy Wilkinson Izzat, who had visions and could apparently manifest unusual light phenomena and also received messages from these beings. So my thought about this is I want to, this trope of future beings coming, us in the future reincarnating in reverse or coming back to this time now to give us messages or something. It is a common trope that you do find in ufology. You also see it now being talked about even in the sort of public sphere with government officials, sort of entertaining this as a potential reality. And so Vallée himself talks about this in some of his books on ufology, and I would like to suggest that Hynek was sympathetic to such a view, and that his interest in Rosicrucianism and his reading of Steiner, perhaps in a direct way, perhaps in an indirect way, links with this notion of these other beings interacting with this, coming down and interacting with this, these sort of elemental or etheric beings or whatever, interacting with us and trying to establish a relationship with us. I have a lot more, but I'm totally out of time, so I did not prepare well. I'm sorry. That's the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since Aaron has a lot more, I think we do still have a little bit of time. We can have some questions, and they're doubtless going to get really interesting responses from all the lot more that we have to say.
So one thing that I think I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on is, have you speculated on the effects of this trope on the people that are telling it? You know what I mean? Because I'm interested in this idea about whether it's not true or false, but if it's us in the future, it's like a total different relationship that's now being articulated. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
What do you think its effect is?
Yeah, well, I do think it definitely has some kind of effect on the present, to sort of this forward future memory idea. It's like rather than sort of looking back, we're looking forward and then modifying or behaving or acting or thinking, forming concepts or thoughts now based on this future memory kind of thing. Yeah, I think it has an effect like that. Of course, like one sort of easy answer is like it's a kind of, more scientific based version of this. Like it's not in a more scientific paradigm, it's perhaps not acceptable to imagine beings from just sort of living spiritual beings of their own accord, having their own ontology, their own existence, doing their own thing. But us with our own technology, having developed it ourselves into the future, coming back to interact with us. It's like a way of framing. It's sort of scientific way of framing it. This is sort of one answer of it. But so I think that's why some people who are probably interested in science, and this whole thing is it's more a mix of science and esotericism, this UFO phenomenon. So that's one answer I would give to it. And I don't know exactly what else, but I do think that it has an interesting effect on the way they would form concepts about what it means about reality and so forth. Thank you.
I think we have time for this.
Kind of in an extension of this, first of all, thank you for the presentation. I always forget to say that. I was so fascinated by what everyone has to say.
Thank you.
But kind of in line with what was already asked. On the flip side, you have people like Bud Hopkins and what was his David Jacobs. Also working a little bit with people like Whitley Strieber.
Right.
They kind of have a message that this is more nefarious
Right.
in a way with the research into abductees and things like that.
Right.
Do you see anything happening there with, I don't know if you've looked into their side of the story?
Yeah, a little bit.
If there are any type of esoteric influences there as well?
I imagine there is. I mean, I'm sure there is, first of all. And that's why Hynek is such a sort of pivotal figure that when I learned of this Steiner connection, for me that's very significant.
Yeah.
So that's why I tried to go more towards him to show it there. But of course, he was so influential that I think that his ideas influenced these ones that you're talking about. So my point, for me, it's just an interesting rabbit hole to some extent. I wrote about Steiner. The other reason I wanted to talk about it is because you can see, like this book and other people who have found that you want to write about this in connection with Hynek, they maybe have not read as much Steiner. They're much more reading Hynek or something. I've read much less Hynek, much more Steiner. So I thought it might be interesting to sort of does Steiner have anything in here that would really sort of connect with the way that this conversation went? So yeah, I think that's why I focused in this way, but I think those ideas then did influence the whole conversation, including this. But you could probably find a lot more other than just this Hynek-Steiner one. I imagine if you were to, especially someone like Strieber, just for example, I remember he was interested in Gurdjieff and so forth. So yeah, when you read, I went back and read Communion a few years ago, and when he's doing his meditations, he's talking about Freemasons and Gurdjieff, so he's clearly reading all this same stuff, But specifically, I don't know other than that.
More to explore.
Yes. And maybe I just run through, they can show them the last slides before we finish, because I didn't get to go through them. anthroposophy and UFOs in New Mexico, which I didn't get to yet. The importance of Rosicrucian and Rosicrucianism as a group, and ufology and how these things are organized, even how Hynek tried to organize his study of it, important. And then the synthesis of these three things, why I think it's important, is it sort of it helps us to sort of understand esotericism and history of science, which is what I did in my dissertation. And it also has these things. I don't know what they are, but they're kinds of technology that are secret, tricky, exist but don't exist, and magical, and so on. And so this technology, military angle is also quite key to this whole thing from Hynek and later, and that's another direction I wanted to sort of highlight here.